Hello and welcome to Model Kit Stuff. Now today we're going to be talking about my compressor setup. One or two people have been asking since we did the sort of walk around of my desk area, and people have asked in the past every now and then, you know, what does my compressor setup look like and why. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to say right from the start, this is not the way to set your compressor up or the compressor configuration you should have. It's just how I do it, and what I'm going to do is talk you through my compressor, why I have this compressor, and why I set it up the way I do. So this is a Sparmax TC610H professional mini piston airbrush compressor. And I've had this now for 5 years, maybe, something like that. And as you'll see, it is a compressor and a tank combination. Now this has a 2.5 litre air tank. So let's talk tanks first. So the reason I have a compressor with an attached air tank is twofold. Firstly, it reduces noise. So having an air tank means that the compressor only needs to work when the air pressure in the tank drops to a certain level. Now, some compressors work differently, and every time you've got the airbrush on, the compressor's running. This one doesn't work like that. What it does is it fills once the tank's filled with air, it maintains the air pressure in the tank. So it means that the compressor actually comes on periodically, not all the time. So I get less noise because it's not running all the time. Because I have a tank, I'm getting a steady airflow. So if I didn't have a tank and you've got just a compressor, what's happening is you're getting a pulse of air through. Now, it might be very, very tiny and not detectable, but that is what's happening. So the compressor is pushing air through in a wave, and that means you're getting pulses through your paint. With a tank, you don't get that. You get a constant flow of paint. So that's the two reasons that I have a tank. Many compressors have a 2 litre tank. This is a 2.5. So basic rule of thumb is the bigger your tank, the less often your compressor has to work. If your compressor is set up to only work when it needs to refill the tank pressure. Like I say, some compressors work all the time that the airbrush is on, maintaining constant pressure. The reason I have the Sparmax brand is it's a trusted, well-known brand in the compressor industry, and one of the things they're known for is reliability. And if I'm going to spend £200 or so on a compressor, which is roughly what these cost in the UK right now, I want to make sure that I'm going to get some good use out of it. So like I say, I've had this 5 years or so. I pretty much, not long after this model came out, I got it, and I've had no problems with it whatsoever. So the compressor is the piece of equipment that's mounted on the top here, and the way the compressor works is it has a preset so that it comes on at 40 psi and switches off at 60 psi. So that's the pressure in your tank. If we take a look at the back, the power cable comes out of the back, and the on-off switch is located just there where my finger is. And it's just a little toggle switch. So that's the basic unit. It comes with this stuck on the front. So what we've got here is a moisture trap. We'll talk about that in a sec. A regulator, and then 2 outlets for airbrushes. Now I believe when you buy these things new, one of them is blanked off. So if you've only got a single airbrush, you can use that, but you do have to have this blanked off. Now I didn't get one. I bought mine through a guy that ended up being a little bit less than honest, and I suspect, because I've got a little dink on there, that this might have actually been used or a second or something like that, but was sold to me as new. I think I got duped. However, it's not an issue because of the way I set it up, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. So let's talk about moisture first. Moisture is something that happens when you've got one of these tank compressor combinations. Basically, the heat from the compressor generates condensation in the tank. So periodically, you really should be draining your tank. But if you have a moisture trap, what that's doing is ensuring that you don't get moisture going into your airline and mixing with your water, with your paint, sorry, so that you've got water coming out with your paint through the airbrush. So that's what the moisture trap does, and you simply press the bottom every now and then to drain it. So I usually do that after every use, but the way I use my airbrush is that as soon as I've finished airbrushing, I tend to drain the tank and take the air out of it. And as a result of that, I get very, very little moisture build-up, if any, and it's only on prolonged use, like painting a 1-200 ship hull, that I might get moisture. So it's quite a dry compressor anyway, just because of how I use it, which is short periods of time. So that's why we have a moisture trap on, and that's why you might get moisture from time to time. So the regulator is controlled by this here. So that allows me to switch it up and down, and then I can click it down to lock it so I can't move it, and I'll lift it up to turn it. So I have two airbrushes set up on this usually, and so I do tend to change my my pressure relatively quite a bit. What I tend to do is have it set at just under 20, which is a sort of a good general setting for both airbrushes. But obviously, if I'm doing detail work like small camouflage patterns, I'll drop it down a little bit, and if I'm doing larger surfaces, I'll crank it up a little bit. And now we're getting into the realms of, and it depends on your paint, and it depends on your atmospheric pressure and what size needle you've got and all of that. And that's a completely different video. So yeah, that's what I do. I have it set up at just under 20. So if I happen to hit the airbrush without thinking, I've got generally a fairly good setting on there anyway. So that's how that works. Now if we look underneath the compressor, we've got here this little chrome plated valve, and this is a drain valve for the tank. So periodically you should loosen that up, just drain it onto a bit of blotting card or tissue paper or something like that, and take any moisture out of your tank. So that's what that's for there. So the next thing that we need to talk about is the air hoses. Now this particular compressor comes with an air hose. Most usually do, but just watch out for that, because sometimes they're not included, or you've also got to check that the diameters are correct for your airbrush. But certainly I've got an airbrush that won't connect to this. So this came with a braided line. I can't remember which one it came with, but I have two, is the bottom line. And all that simply happens is that I connect them on and I leave them on. I don't really ever take them off, unless I'm having to pack everything away. And it's the day after Boxing Day today, and I am setting things back up, which is why it seemed like a good time to do this video. So my two airlines are attached and left on permanently, and that allows me to have two airbrushes permanently attached, and we'll talk about why I do that in a second. So when you have your compressor set up, you need to make sure that you've got space for your airline to move around when you're airbrushing, and that you've got this nicely out of the way. You're not going to get paint on it or anything like that. So it also needs to be on a nice flat surface to make sure that the compressor operates properly. So in this case, this sits on the floor because the floor's nice and even. And if your surface is even, then you get even less noise out of this. And this is a particularly quiet compressor. When I read some of the reviews about this before I bought it, that was one of the considerations was noise, and this is certainly one of the more quieter ones, or was at the time when I bought it. So the next thing in my compressor setup is actually how I attach my airline to my airbrush. So I've got two different attachments here just to show you. This airline is a standard airline with a standard fitting, and this one comes with a quick release fitting already built into the line. Now you can buy quick release fittings separately, and I recommend you should do. I'm just going to show you why. So if you've got a traditional connection at the end of your airline for your airbrush, what you do is just tighten that up and screw it onto the thread at the bottom of your airbrush where the air inlet is, and then you're attached. And what happens is two things. Firstly, when you're using your airbrush, the airline is static, so it's moving with your airbrush. Now it could be that's okay. It could be that as you're using your airbrush, you're holding it like that and you're holding it away. But if you're going around lots of little corners and stuff, taking the airbrush with you, I personally think you're more likely to twist the airbrush and over time cause fraying of the end of the airline. Now, it's never happened to me, but the airline has to move with you. So you can see there, as I'm moving the airbrush, that's moving. So it seems logical that you're putting some form of stress on this bit of the airline. And the second thing is, when you've finished using your airbrush and you've finished painting, you've got to take this off and strip it down and clean it or whatever you're going to do. Then you've got to unscrew it. And if you've got a blockage or something like that, you're having to take this off, and it just takes a moment or two. But that's how it works. Now, if you get a quick fit line, that has a bit of an advantage, I believe. So let's show you how that works. If you're buying the adapter, then what you'll need is an adapter for your airbrush, a fitting, and the quick release fitting itself. So the quick release fitting just goes into your airline like your airbrush does. Okay, so that is now on, and you put the adapter on the end of your airbrush. Like so, finger tight should be enough. And then all that happens is that your airbrush clicks in. And then to release it, you pull this collar back down and it releases it. Now you'll see there's a little groove in there, and that's the part that gets grabbed by this. So first thing that happens is you'll notice that you've got a longer section here for your airbrushing, and this now swivels, so my airline can stay still and this can move inside there. and I think that just helps, especially if you're at the end of your extended of your airline. It just helps a little bit. Now that's in my mind. That might be rubbish, but that's what I think. And the second thing is, if you need to take this off and give it a quick rinse out of the tap, away you go. You're not having to unscrew it. You're not having to spin your airbrush round or anything like that. It's just on and off, and I just find it more convenient. So I think they're a good thing to have. So I have two airbrushes permanently set up, and I've got two different brands. I've got an Iwata Eclipse, and I've got a Hadder and Steinbach Evolution. And of the two airbrushes, I prefer the Evolution, and I'll talk you through the differences in the airbrushes in a moment to give you an understanding of why I have two different types. So the reason I have two airbrushes permanently set up on my compressor is it allows me to have two different needles permanently set up. So it stops me having to change out needles. So I have a 0.2 in the Eclipse, I had to think then for a minute, and I have a 0.4 in the Evolution. And I do have different size needles for each one, so I can put a 0.2 in this one, and I can put a 0.4 and a 0.5 in this one. So I can change the airbrushes around if I wish, but I have these set up like that so that no matter what the paint job comes along, I'm already set up. I've not got to strip the airbrush, put a new needle in. So having two airbrushes on allows me to have those two needles all ready to go. And it doesn't really matter which one you have them in. I tend to do detail work with this, even though this one is, in my view, nicer at doing it. So let's talk about the differences in the airbrushes next. So my Iwata Eclipse is the airbrush that I tend to use for detail work. And the reason is this is a side feed airbrush, which means that the paint cup fits into the side. So I have a small paint cup that fits into the side, or I can put a large bottle in as well, but I've actually never used that. So I can put a small amount of paint into the cup. The cup's adjustable, so if I'm painting at an angle, I can angle the cup so that it doesn't spill. And this is ideal for small amounts of paint. And the reason why I chose a side feed in this instance was putting the cup on the side allows you to have a clear angle of sight right down the airbrush. So when I'm doing some paint work and I'm painting on my job, I can look straight down the airbrush and I've not got a paint cup in the way like I would have if I was using that. So that's the advantage of a side feed. So when you're doing lots of detail work, so if you use an airbrush for painting figures, for example, I think a side feed's a better option. If you do lots and lots of camouflage and your thing is tanks or small aircraft that needs lots of detail work and you're doing small amounts of detail spraying, I think a side feed is better personally, just from the point of view of an angle of sight. So you get a really great view with a side feed, and it doesn't matter whether you use your thumb or your finger for painting, you've still got a really good angle of sight. So that's why I have a side feed brush, and that's why I have the smaller needle in here as a rule, and generally keep this one for the detail work. Now, this airbrush itself is a good, reliable airbrush. It's easy to strip down, easy to clean, Yeah, it's a really good brush. Lots and lots of people have reviewed them. I read lots of reviews of lots of airbrushes before finally choosing this one, and I'm very happy with it. But my Evolution is my preferred airbrush. My Evolution is a top feed airbrush, and the reason that I have a top feed airbrush, given what I was just saying about angle of sight, is that I tend to use this for not for detail work, so for everything else. So 90 to 95% of my airbrushing is done by this brush rather than the Iwata. And when I was deciding which one was going to be the detail brush, it was partly because of the side feed, but partly because this brush is even easier to strip down than the Iwata. It's very, very simple, and I generally have less issues with this. So if I'm going to have a needle stick or bubbles coming up in the paint cup or something like that, it generally is going to happen to my Eclipse than rather than my Evolution. So I tend to strip down and clean after every use. Personal thing, I know not everyone does that, but I find that this brush is more sensitive to perhaps not having been cleaned quite as closely as it should be, and this one allows you to get away with a little bit more. Also, this one has got, because it's got more movable parts, it's got more things that might not be right or might not be tightened up properly. This has got less moving parts, and so we have less issues with that. Particularly, the head assembly of this is a lot simpler than the head assembly of that, and it's the head assembly where you tend to get most of your issues, and generally it's around seals and not having things tightened up. Also, I find this brush is easier to clean than this one, and this one is quite an easy brush to clean in the first instance, so this one is a very easy brush to clean. So that's my take on comparing the two. We will stop there. They're both great brushes. I just prefer this one. And the reason why I bought this one is to do with paint cup sizes. So as you saw with the Eclipse, I can go from a small paint cup to a very large paint cup. Well, this one has a detachable paint cup. So I can do a few drops without a paint cup at all. I can put a small paint cup on, which allows me to do several drops with some thinner and what have you, and I've got plenty of space in the cup to do that. Or I can swap it for a bigger one, which is still a lot smaller than the bottle. So it gives me some flexibility, and I can buy different sizes to add on, and they all come as a standard size to attach. So I like that feature, that I can do different size paint cups. Generally, I find the larger paint cup is easier to clean and get in and clean than the smaller one, so I tend to have the larger one on, even if I could really use this one. This one's just quicker to clean because I can get my fingers in better. But yeah, so that's why I have the number 4 on, and the number 4, I can do some relatively good detail work with number 4, but I can also spray a hull. So it's a good general needle to have in here. I have the airbrushes set up the way I do with two airbrushes. The only thing that I do when I switch the compressor on, the only thing I do before I start painting is remove the needle guard, and that just stops any paint hitting the rim of here and then causing splatter. So what you'll see is there's little, if I can get that in shot, there we go, there is little holes in the side of this. That's to stop you putting your finger over the end and doing blowback It's recommended not to do that in the manuals. So that's to prevent you from doing it. The downside of those little holes is that paint can gather on those as it's spraying through, and then you get some spatter. So I tend to just take it off and then put it back on just before I put the airbrush back down. And the last component of my airbrush compressor setup is an airbrush stand. Now I have one that clamps to the side of my table, and the reason that I do that is because I'm working on a table, and so having this attached to the table means I can move it and have it attached right next to me. So if I'm doing a large airbrush session, I can have this right to hand and have both airbrushes to hand. If I'm not airbrushing, I can move this round the table and have it well out of the way, and everything's out of harm's way. So basically, it's just a C-clip that clamps this to the table. Now this one takes 4 airbrushes. I would always recommend that you've got more capacity than airbrushes. So if you do add additional airbrushes in time, then you're future-proofed. When I bought this, I actually had 3 airbrushes. I'm now down to 2. I got rid of my Badger because I hated it. I had a Badger Patriot. I just could not get on with that brush at all. Never worked first time. A nightmare to strip down, and you have to drag the needle out of the back of the airbrush, so you're always dragging paint through it. Just not a well thought through product. Anyway, so I currently have 3, but one of them won't attach to this. It's my original airbrush. I guess I'm sentimentally attached to it and can't get rid of it. But it's a really good airbrush. But I think the needle's probably like a millimetre or 1.5 millimetres or something. It's huge when I look at it now. Anyway, when it comes to an airbrush stand, this setup here is better than this setup here. So that's quicker to get your airbrush in and out, and it looks all funky and so on, and you can just, put it in and out of its holster. But actually, you can catch this and whip the airbrush out and have it drop on the floor and cause yourself a world of hurt. Whereas with this one, because the airline goes through the middle, you cannot accidentally knock that off. So that's why I prefer that type of setting. Obviously, it's a little more difficult to put your brush on, but it's worth the extra fraction of a second, to be quite honest, to make sure that you're not going to have an accident and drop it off, because these things can get wrapped around your foot without you noticing and stuff if you're not careful. It has happened. So just something to think about there, but that's how I have this set up. So when I first switch on my compressor, it will run, as you just heard, until it gets to 60 psi in the tank, and at that point I know I am ready to go. My compressor is only going to come on again if it gets down to 40 psi. So unlike some people's compressor where it might just come on randomly, mine's not going to do that. It will only come on when the air pressure drops. So I am now ready to airbrush. And as soon as I get to 40 psi, it'll kick in again and take it back up to 60. So let's see how long that takes. And there you have it. That is my airbrush setup with my compressor. So I hope that was useful for those of you that were asking about it. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and if I feel like I'm qualified to answer them, I certainly will. Okay, take care everyone. Thanks for looking in, enjoy your modelling, and I will see you very soon.